The sun was setting over the Egyptian horizon, casting long shadows across the prison yard. Among the prisoners was Joseph, a Hebrew young man with an extraordinary gift for interpreting dreams. Life had been far from kind to Joseph. Betrayed by his jealous brothers and sold into slavery, he had risen to serve in the house of Potiphar, a high-ranking official. But false accusations had landed him in prison, where he now waited, seemingly forgotten. Yet even in the dimness of the prison walls, Joseph's faith in God never wavered. His kindness and wisdom caught the attention of the prison warden, who placed Joseph in charge of the other prisoners. It was in this grim setting that Joseph's gift would once again shine. One morning, Joseph noticed two of his fellow prisoners, the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, sitting with troubled expressions. "Why do you look so sad today?" Joseph asked, his voice steady and kind. "We both had dreams," the cupbearer replied, "but there is no one to interpret them." Joseph smiled gently. "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." The cupbearer began. "In my dream, I saw a vine with 3 branches. As it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in his hand." Joseph listened carefully, then said, "This is what your dream means. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will once again place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do." Encouraged by the hopeful interpretation, the baker shared his dream. "In my dream, I had 3 baskets of bread on my head. The top basket was filled with baked goods for Pharaoh, but birds were eating them out of the basket." Joseph's expression grew somber. "This is what your dream means. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole. The birds will eat away your flesh." Though the interpretation was grim, Joseph spoke with honesty, trusting that God's truth would prevail. 3 days later, Pharaoh's birthday arrived, and the events unfolded exactly as Joseph had said. The cupbearer was restored to his position, while the baker met a tragic end. Before the cupbearer left the prison, Joseph made a heartfelt request. "When all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." But the cupbearer, in his joy and relief, forgot about Joseph. 2 long years passed. Joseph continued to serve faithfully in the prison, trusting that God had not abandoned him. Then one night, Pharaoh himself had 2 strange dreams that left him deeply unsettled. He summoned Egypt's magicians and wise men, but none could interpret the dreams. Pharaoh grew increasingly frustrated. It was then that the cupbearer remembered Joseph. "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings," he said to Pharaoh. "When I was in prison, there was a young Hebrew man who interpreted my dream and the dream of the baker. Both turned out exactly as he said." Pharaoh's interest was piqued, and he immediately sent for Joseph. The guards rushed to the prison, bringing Joseph out and preparing him to stand before the king. Joseph cleaned himself up, changed into fresh clothes, and stood humbly before Pharaoh. "Pharaoh," Joseph said respectfully, "how may I serve you?" "I have had 2 dreams," Pharaoh said, "but no one can interpret them. I have heard it said that you, Joseph, can interpret dreams." Joseph shook his head slightly. "I cannot do it," he replied, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Pharaoh nodded and began to recount his dreams. In the first he had seen 7 sleek, healthy cows grazing by the Nile. Then 7 scrawny, ugly cows came up out of the river and devoured the healthy cows. In the second dream, he saw 7 heads of grain, full and ripe, growing on a single stalk. Suddenly, 7 thin, scorched heads of grain sprouted and swallowed up the full heads. Pharaoh paused, his brow furrowed with worry. What do these dreams mean? Joseph listened intently, and as Pharaoh finished, he began to sense God's hand guiding his thoughts. He took a deep breath, prepared to share the interpretation. Joseph looked at Pharaoh with calm confidence, a peace that came from his trust in God. Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same, he began. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 full heads of grain both represent 7 years of abundance, but the 7 scrawny cows and the 7 thin heads of grain scorched by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. Pharaoh's eyes widened as Joseph's words sunk in. Joseph continued, "The famine will be so severe that it will completely overshadow the years of abundance. The reason you had the dream in 2 forms is because the matter has been firmly decided by God, and He will do it soon." The room grew quiet, except for the sound of Pharaoh tapping his fingers on his throne, deep in thought. Joseph took the opportunity to speak again. "Now, let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man to put in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food and store it in the cities under Pharaoh's authority. This reserve will be used during the 7 years of famine so that the country will not be ruined." Pharaoh stared at Joseph, impressed by the clarity of his words and the wisdom of his plan. Though Joseph was still technically a prisoner, his insight had caught Pharaoh's attention in a way no one else had managed to do. The court buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Pharaoh finally stood, his gaze fixed on Joseph. "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" he declared. Turning to Joseph, Pharaoh announced, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." The room erupted into astonishment. Just moments ago, Joseph had been a prisoner in chains, and now he was being made the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Pharaoh removed his signet ring and placed it on Joseph's hand, a symbol of the authority he was entrusting to him. He dressed Joseph in fine robes of linen and placed a gold chain around his neck. Joseph was paraded through the streets in a chariot, with servants shouting before him, "Make way!" Joseph, now known as Zaphanath-Paneah, stood tall in his new role. His journey from the pit of slavery to the pinnacle of power was a testament to God's faithfulness and purpose, even through the trials he had endured. As Joseph surveyed the land of Egypt, he knew the years of abundance would soon begin. But his focus was already on preparing for the famine that would follow. God had placed him here for a reason, and he was determined to fulfill his purpose. Joseph wasted no time in stepping into his new role. Pharaoh's trust in him was absolute, and Joseph knew he had to act quickly. He began traveling throughout Egypt, meeting with officials, inspecting fields, and laying out plans for the years of plenty and the famine that would follow. For 7 years, the land of Egypt experienced an incredible abundance. The crops flourished under the warm sun, and the storehouses Joseph had ordered to be built were soon overflowing with grain. Fields of wheat stretched as far as the eye could see, shimmering like a golden sea. Farmers worked tirelessly, and Joseph ensured that a fifth of all the harvest was collected and stored in every major city. The people of Egypt marveled at Joseph's leadership. He didn't simply oversee the collection of grain, he worked alongside the people, earning their respect. His presence inspired trust. He never complained, even when the work was grueling. God is preparing us. Joseph would remind anyone who doubted the need for such massive stores of food. As the storehouses filled, the abundance became almost unimaginable. "There is so much grain, it's like counting the stars," one official said with a laugh. Joseph nodded, but his smile was subdued. He never lost sight of what was coming after these plentiful years. Meanwhile, Joseph's life had also taken a personal turn. Pharaoh had given him a wife, Asenath, and Joseph found comfort and companionship in his marriage. In time, they were blessed with 2 sons. The first he named Manasseh, saying, "God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second he named Ephraim, declaring, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Though Joseph was content, memories of his family in Canaan lingered. He hadn't seen his father, Jacob, or his brothers in years. He wondered if they ever thought of him, if they regretted selling him into slavery. But Joseph buried those thoughts deep, focusing instead on the task God had placed before him. Finally, the 7 years of abundance came to an end. Just as Joseph had warned, the famine began. The lush fields turned dry and cracked under the scorching sun. Rivers and streams dwindled, and crops failed across the region. Soon, hunger spread, not just in Egypt, but to neighboring lands as well. In Egypt, however, the people were prepared. Thanks to Joseph's foresight, the storehouses were opened, and grain was distributed to the hungry. Pharaoh's confidence in Joseph grew even stronger as the nation weathered the crisis under his careful leadership. "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you," Pharaoh instructed anyone in need. But the famine was relentless, and as the months passed, people from other nations began arriving in Egypt, desperate for food. The reputation of Egypt's well-stocked storehouses had spread far and wide, and Joseph found himself overseeing the distribution to not only Egyptians but also to foreigners who came seeking help. One day, as Joseph stood at the gates where grain was being sold, a group of men approached. They were weary from travel, their clothes dusty and worn. Joseph's heart skipped a beat as he recognized them. They were his brothers, the very ones who had betrayed him and sold him into slavery so many years ago. Joseph's mind raced. They hadn't recognized him in his royal garments, speaking the Egyptian language and holding such authority. A wave of emotions crashed over him: anger, sorrow, longing. He was no longer the helpless boy they had thrown into a pit. Now he held the power to decide their fate. But Joseph didn't reveal himself, not yet. Instead, he tested them. "Where do you come from?" he demanded, his voice stern. "From the land of Canaan, to buy food," they replied, bowing before him. Joseph's eyes narrowed. "You are spies. You've come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," one of them protested, their faces pale with fear. "We are honest men, not spies. We are 12 brothers, the sons of one man, but the youngest is with our father, and one is no more." Joseph's heart ached at their words, but he kept his composure. "Prove your honesty," he said. "One of you must stay here, while the rest return home and bring your youngest brother to me. Until then, you will not see my face again." His brothers exchanged nervous glances, but they agreed. As they were escorted away, Joseph turned and walked into the palace, his emotions a storm within him. The famine had brought them together again, but what would come of it? Joseph's brothers returned to Canaan with sacks full of grain, but their hearts were heavy. They knew they couldn't avoid the command given by the powerful Egyptian leader. They would have to bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, back with them. This was no small request. Jacob, their father, had been fiercely protective of Benjamin ever since losing Joseph, whom he believed to be dead. As they reached home, the brothers explained the situation to Jacob. "The man, the lord of the land, spoke harshly to us. He said we could not see his face again unless we bring Benjamin with us," Reuben said solemnly. Jacob's face darkened with sorrow. "You have already taken Joseph from me. Now you want to take Benjamin too? If anything happens to him, I will go to my grave in despair." The grain they had brought back lasted for a while, but the famine continued. The family's food supplies dwindled once again. Judah finally stepped forward. "Father, we cannot go back to Egypt without Benjamin." The man was clear. "You will not see my face unless your brother is with you. Let him go with me. I will guarantee his safety. If I fail to bring him back, you can hold me personally responsible." Reluctantly, Jacob agreed. He sent Benjamin with his brothers, along with gifts of balm, honey, spices, and silver as a peace offering. "May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will let your other brother and Benjamin return," Jacob said, with a heavy heart. When Joseph saw his brothers arrive with Benjamin, he was overwhelmed with emotion. For the first time in years, he laid eyes on his youngest brother, the one he had never stopped missing. But Joseph kept his identity hidden and continued with his plan. He instructed his steward to prepare a feast for the brothers. The men were nervous as they were led into Joseph's home. "It must be because of the silver that was returned to our sacks," they whispered. "He's going to attack us and make us slaves." When they tried to explain the situation to the steward, he reassured them. "Your God, the God of your father, must have given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." The brothers were brought before Joseph, who greeted them warmly. When he saw Benjamin, he could barely contain his emotions. "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Without waiting for an answer, he turned away, his eyes filling with tears. The brothers sat down to eat, amazed at the kindness being shown to them. They noticed, however, that they were seated in the exact order of their birth, a detail that puzzled them. Benjamin was given 5 times as much food as the others, yet no one dared to question it. As the feast ended, Joseph devised one final test. He instructed his steward to fill the brothers' sacks with as much grain as they could carry and to place each man's silver back in his sack. Then he gave a secret order: "Put my silver cup in the youngest one's sack." The brothers set out for home the next morning, relieved to have their grain and Benjamin safe. But their journey was interrupted when Joseph's steward caught up to them. "Why have you repaid good with evil?" he demanded. "Why did you steal my master's silver cup?" The brothers were shocked. "Why would we do such a thing? If any of us is found with the cup, he will die, and the rest of us will become your slaves." The steward searched their sacks one by one, starting with the oldest. When he reached Benjamin's sack, he pulled out the silver cup. The brothers tore their clothes in anguish. They returned to the city and threw themselves before Joseph. "We are guilty," Judah said. "We will all become your slaves." But Joseph replied, "Only the one who was found with the cup will become my slave. The rest of you may go." Judah stepped forward, his voice filled with desperation. "Please, my lord, let me speak. My father's life is bound up with the boy's life. If he does not return, my father will die of grief. Take me instead. Let me remain as your slave in place of the boy. Let the boy return with his brothers." Joseph could no longer keep up the act. Moved by Judah's plea, he ordered everyone but his brothers to leave the room. Then he revealed his true identity. The room was silent as Joseph's brothers stared at him, trying to process his words. "I am Joseph," he said again, his voice trembling with emotion. "Is my father still alive?" The brothers were stunned. Their faces turned pale as fear gripped their hearts. This powerful man, second only to Pharaoh, was the very brother they had betrayed and sold into slavery. Seeing their fear, Joseph softened his tone. "Come closer to me," he said. As they hesitated, he reassured them, "It was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Joseph embraced each of his brothers, and their fear gave way to relief and joy. For the first time in years, the family was beginning to heal. Joseph instructed them, "Hurry back to my father and tell him, Joseph is still alive. He is ruler of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children, and your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have, I will provide for you there." The brothers returned to Canaan, eager to share the incredible news with Jacob. At first, their father could hardly believe them. "Joseph is alive? He is the ruler of Egypt?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. But when he saw the carts and provisions Joseph had sent, his spirit was revived. "My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die," Jacob declared. The journey to Egypt was long, but Jacob's excitement grew with each passing mile. When they finally arrived, Joseph rode out to meet his father. As soon as he saw Jacob, he ran to him and threw his arms around him, weeping. "Now I am ready to die," Jacob said, tears streaming down his face, "since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." Joseph settled his family in Goshen, a fertile region perfect for their flocks and herds. Pharaoh, upon hearing of Joseph's family, welcomed them warmly. "The best of Egypt will be yours," he said, instructing his officials to provide for them. Years passed, and the famine eventually came to an end. Joseph continued to serve Pharaoh faithfully, managing Egypt's resources with wisdom and integrity. His family thrived in Goshen, and the bonds between them grew stronger. Before Jacob passed away, he called his sons together to bless them and to remind them of God's promises. "Bury me with my fathers," he instructed, "in the cave, in the field of Machpelah." After Jacob's death, Joseph and his brothers honored his request, carrying his body back to Canaan for burial. Following Jacob's burial, the brothers grew anxious, fearing that Joseph might seek revenge now that their father was gone. They approached him, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs they committed in treating you so badly." When Joseph heard this, he wept. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph's words reassured his brothers, and peace reigned among them. Joseph's story, one of betrayal, resilience, and forgiveness, became a testimony to God's faithfulness and his ability to bring good out of even the darkest circumstances. Through Joseph, the people of Israel were preserved, setting the stage for the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. And so Joseph's life stood as a reminder that no matter how difficult the journey, God's plans are always greater than we can imagine.